There's a lot of different topics to cover in Chapter 5 here as we talk about cost, volume, profit. So I'm going to just go over some of the basics of each of the different topics and try to give an overview of this chapter. So the first thing we talk about in this chapter is that costs behave in different types of ways. So the first type of cost behavior that we talk about is that we have costs that can be variable in nature. So the first thing you want to think about with variable costs is the word variable means that they change. And the name of the cost implies what happens in total for those costs. So in total, a variable cost will increase, as you can see here from this graph, as we increase the amount of activity. But on a per unit basis, what happens is those variable costs need to stay the same. So in each case here, whether I have 2 tablets produced or 6 or 10, on a per unit basis, they're all going to cost $10. So then when I produce 2, it costs 20, 4, it costs 40, 6, it costs 60, right? In total, variable costs are going to change because the word variable means change. So that's one type of cost behavior we can see. The other type of cost behavior we can see is that our costs could be fixed. And again, the word that we talk about here implies what happens in total. So fixed costs in total are going to stay the same because that's what something that's fixed would mean, right? So it doesn't matter if I produce 2 or 6 or 10 tablets. In total, if I have a fixed cost, it's going to be 10,000 in this case. What that means then is on a per unit basis, the more tablets I produce, that rent that we're talking about here is going to be spread over all of those units. So if it's 10,000 in total and I produce 2 units, then each unit costs 5. But if I produce 4 units, then each unit is going to cost less, right? So the more units I produce, the less it's going to cost on a per unit basis. So variable means it changes in total. Fixed means it stays the same in total. But we do also have some costs that have an element of both. They have part variable and part fixed. And so what we need to think about is, okay, well, first of all, we are never going to have zero costs if we have a mixed cost situation. And we're always going to start at that fixed cost and just continue to go up from there. So that's what a mixed cost is going to look like graphically. So one of the things that we have to deal with is if I have a mixed cost, how can I break it down into its fixed and variable components? So we're going to use a method called the high-low method. And so the first thing that we have to think about is that if the cost is changing, that has to be because of the variable component. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at the high level of activity and the low level of activity, and we're going to look at the change in the cost at those 2 levels of activity compared to the change in the activity, right? Because as we change, fixed costs will continue to stay fixed, so any change is going to be because of that variable cost. So we're going to look at the change in our total cost divided by the change in our activity, and that's going to tell us our variable cost per unit. All right, so that's the first step. So if I know what my total cost is at a variety of levels of activities, I'm going to use that to first of all figure out my variable cost. And then because I know that my total cost has to be equal to my variable cost plus my fixed cost, if I know my total and I know my variable, then I can back into what the fixed cost is. So that's what we're going to do for step 2. So that's kind of how the high-low method works, and it's one of the ways that we can say, okay, if my cost is a mixed cost, has both variable and fixed, if I want to understand how that cost is behaving, I need to break it into the 2 components. So I'm going to use this high-low method to be able to do that. Okay, so why are we going to do that? Well, we need to understand our costs and our cost behavior specifically so that we can analyze those costs, because we want to use that to make some various decisions, right? Like figure out what mix of products should we be selling, or how can I maximize my facilities, and what do I need to do in terms of selling prices. There's all sorts of reasons that I need to understand my cost and my cost behavior. And the biggest thing that we're probably going to be able to easily see is that we want to try to plan what is our profit going to be at various levels of activity. If I can figure out how my costs behave, I can figure out what my profit's going to be. And that's what we call our cost volume profit analysis. So one of the most basic tools that we use in cost volume profit analysis is a different type of income statement. We call it our CVP income statement. So if I know how much I'm selling each camcorder for, and I know what my variable costs are, and I know what my fixed costs are, I can set up my income statement so that I can easily use it as an analysis tool. So I'll see that my sales are going to be based on whatever my selling price was. My variable costs are going to change depending on the level of activity. And we have a new subtotal here called our contribution margin. So we're going to talk about that a little bit in this chapter, but that contribution margin is going to change just based on the behavior of what goes into it, right? So sales, we know, changes depending on level of activity. Variable costs change depending on level of activity. Therefore, our contribution margin changes depending on level of activity. And so we look at that contribution margin and say, what do we have that then contributes towards covering those costs that don't change, which is our fixed costs. And then after we subtract out our fixed costs, we come down to our bottom line net income. So one of the things that I want to point out is that this is different than our traditional income statement, but just in the way that we break down our costs. So your sales amount is not going to change, and your net income amount is not going to change, but we are taking our other costs as we would have normally looked at them in a traditional income statement, and we're going to break them down by behavior, looking specifically at what is variable and what is fixed. Okay, so how's that going to help us? Well, again, we can look at, if I know my selling price and I know my variable cost per unit, I can look at the per unit contribution margin. And that's going to help us in a number of ways. Specifically, we can think about where are we going to end up at zero net income. So in this case, I want to talk about it and kind of work backwards. So if my net income is zero and I know my fixed costs are $200,000, what that tells me is my contribution margin needs to be $200,000 as well, right? If I want to break even and have zero profit, I need my contribution margin to be equal to my fixed costs. So if I have a contribution margin per unit of $200 and I need a total contribution margin of $200,000, I can divide then and figure out that I need to sell 1,000 camcorders. So this is one way that we can kind of back into and start thinking about how can I analyze my profit, right? And you might be asking yourself, well, why do I want to focus on break even? Well, break even, which is our zero profit, right, is typically not our target. But what we want to know is, where am I going to break even? Because once I get above that point, everything else is just going to fall to our bottom line net income. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I sell one more camcorder past that break-even point, if I'm at 1,001 camcorders, my sales amount is going to go up by another $500,000. My variable costs, or $500, I should say, because it's $500 per unit. My variable costs go up by another $300, and my contribution margin goes up by another $200, right? So notice that entire contribution margin from that one extra unit goes right down to the bottom line net income because we've already covered those fixed expenses. So every unit that we sell beyond that break-even point is going to drop right to the bottom line because we've already covered those fixed costs. So that's one thing that's going to become important. Another thing that we talk about here is something called the contribution margin ratio. And again, all of this is going to help us analyze our overall profitability and the relationship between our costs, our volume, and our profit. So in this case, we have our unit contribution margin. of $200. We have a selling price of $500. The contribution margin ratio says what percentage is my contribution margin of my selling price. So we're going to take $200 divided by 500 and say it's 40%. And so the reason that's going to be helpful is for any level of sales that I have then, let's say I sell $100,000. What I now know is that my contribution margin is 40% of that, right? So my contribution margin, would be 40,000. And then if I wanted to back into it, I would know then that my variable costs are 60,000. So knowing our contribution margin ratio, again, can be a helpful analysis tool, which we're going to see in just a second. So let's take a look then at how all of this can be helpful, right? Again, looking at both knowing what's going on a per unit basis and also knowing what's going on in terms of the percentage of sales is going to help us analyze what's going on with the overall company. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to think about something called break-even analysis, right? We just talked about why it's important to know your break-even point, because that's kind of your pivotal point between where you're going to go up and have a profit from there and go down and have a loss from there. And so it's really important that we can calculate that break-even point. Well, we just talked about how we can do it with an income statement approach, but let's take a look at how we can do it more just in a mathematical way or by using that contribution margin ratio that I was just talking about. So the equation that we want to focus in on here is the one here at the top. We know that if we take our sales minus our variable costs minus my fixed costs, that's going to give me my net income. I know I want net income of 0. I know that my fixed costs are $200,000. I know that on a per unit basis, I'm going to sell my product for $500 and I'd multiply it times however many units I sell. My variable cost is $300, again, times the number of units that I sell. So if I plug everything in that I know, again, knowing that I want a net income of 0 because I'm trying to break even, all I have to do is solve here and I can figure out what Q is. So again, we've already done this in an income statement approach, but we can figure out that if I sell 1,000 units, that's where I'm going to break even. Now notice that I started with this initial equation up here, but when I ultimately get down to kind of simplifying the equation, what I'm really doing is taking my fixed cost divided by my contribution margin per unit. So in the book, they actually give you sort of both of these equations, but hopefully looking at it like this, it will tell you and show you how you can easily get from one to another. One is just a more common sense, sales minus variable cost minus fixed cost gives you net income. The other is more of the simplified approach, but they get you to the same point. So if we think about it, though, more from a contribution margin technique, what we realize here is that our total revenues minus our variable costs give us contribution margin. And again, we want to think about how does that ratio fit into this. So we said that the fixed cost, $200,000, divided by the contribution margin per unit of $200 gives us our 1,000 units. So if I want to figure out what my break even in units is, I'm going to think about the contribution margin per unit. But in some cases, I want to know what my what my break even amount is in dollars. And so remember that we said whatever our sales dollars are multiplied by that contribution margin ratio will give us our contribution margin. So if I know that my contribution margin is 200,000 and I know that that 200,000 in this case is 40% of my sales, if I divide the 200,000 by 40%, that's how I can back into my break-even sales. So that's another way that we can analyze what's going on. Again, the focus here is on figuring out break-even in dollars, whereas in the prior example, we were looking at break-even in units. So a couple of different ways to kind of get us to the same point. If we expand that just a little bit, Instead of saying that we want to break even, we might say that we want to come up with a target net income. And so that means I don't want to have zero net income, but I instead want a certain amount of net income. So let's say, for example, that we want to have a target net income of 120,000. Well, we would just plug that 120,000 in instead of the zero, but leave everything else the same, selling it for 500, variable cost of 300 per unit, fixed cost of 200,000. And so again, if we simplify the equation, where we end up with is we take those fixed costs of 200,000 plus that net income and divide that by the contribution margin per unit. So notice, as hopefully it makes sense to you, that instead of if I instead of breaking even want to have a profit, the first thing that I should think about is, well, I was breaking even when I was selling 1,000 units. It makes sense that I need to sell more units if I want to have a profit. So this is one of those areas where you want to start to think about, does my answer make sense? Okay. The last thing in this chapter is talking about something called margin of safety. And again, we talked about this break-even point is sort of our pivotal point. So one of the things that companies want to know is, how far away from that break-even point are you? So that's what margin of safety tells us. We take our actual or expected sales, compare that to our break-even sales, and margin of safety is the difference. So if I'm going to break even at 500,000, but I'm actually at 750,000, that means I have a cushion, right? Like a safety cushion of 250,000. So I could lose 250,000 before I start getting to the point of sales dollars, before I start getting to the point where I would be close to break even. So margin of safety is kind of looking at what's my cushion, right, as they talk about here. So the other thing that we can take a look at is, what is that in terms of a percentage? So sometimes we want to look at, well, I could lose 250,000, but the last thing that I want to think about is, well, 250,000 is what percent of my current sales, which is 750,000. So in this case, if I divide those two, I can look at that as a percentage as well. So 250,000 divided by 750,000 would give us our contribution, our margin of safety percentage, which in this case is 33.33%. So sometimes we could say we're going to lose 250,000, or in this case, 33% of our current sales before we break even. So lots of different topics to talk about in this chapter, just to highlight an overview of all the different things that we're going to start talking about when we start analyzing the relationship between cost, volume, and profit.